Okay, great. Well, thank you all for getting up this morning. I'm sure it must have been very tempting to stay snuggled in the warm bed. And I also want, if I may, to begin by thanking our hosts, Camilo, Raúl, John, and Francisco, for arranging this and also for giving me an opportunity to tell you a little bit about our work. The talk I'm going to give today will be a kind of an overview of some very large questions. In particular, the question that I'm interested in is where moral values come from. And so I will kind of present the big picture. I think some of what has gone before in talks yesterday will also be relevant to this question, and certainly some of the talks that will come after mine will also be relevant. I should also just say that I will be drawing fairly heavily on the book that was published by Princeton in 2011. So I want to begin with this slide just to remind ourselves a little bit about our hominin ancestors. We have years and millions on the vertical axis, spatial extent on the horizontal axis, and there are several things that are worth noticing, of course, and that is that hominins have been around for several million years. Humans are thought to have, that is Homo sapiens, are thought to have been around for about 250,000 years. It's interesting to see how well Homo erectus did, both in terms of the time that they were on the planet and also their spatial peregrinations. They had a brain that was between about 800 and 1,000 cc's. Ours is between about 1,300 and 1,500 cc's. And it's very interesting to realize that, of course, they must have had social groups not unlike the social groups of early Homo sapiens, on the order of 20 to 50 individuals. They almost certainly had a variety of kinds of social practices and did extremely well for a very long time. They built boats, rafts at any rate, and got themselves to Polynesia. Now, part of what's also, I think, worth thinking about in this slide, and it's something that's just become a slight obsession with me, and that is that until very recently, Homo sapiens basically just got along with stone tools, with hand axes. I mean, we don't see any evidence even of spears until about 50,000 years ago. So, and the kinds of things that we now think are obvious, such as making marks to represent other things in writing, did not come about until about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. So there they were, roving about the face of the planet, Homo sapiens, essentially like us genetically. And they didn't figure out all these things that we think are terribly obvious, such as the wheel, or attaching a stick to a rock to make a club. And I think that's worth pondering because much, and this is a point that many anthropologists have made, as well as psychologists like Don Norman, much of what makes us smart is the culture that we live in. And that it may turn out that it's a very little thing that allows for the accumulation of knowledge such that you get a culture. And so sometimes when we reflect on what it is that makes us unique, it may be that we need to go back and think about Homo sapiens in Africa about 200,000 years ago, who were genetically, apart from a few digestive enzymes and a bit of this and that, were essentially the same as we are, so far as we know. Now, the question of sociality is linked to the question of morality. My take on it is that, to a first approximation, there are social conventions that are more or less important for adherence and membership in the group. And then there are certain kinds of practices that are of great moment in terms of the survival and the well-being of individuals in the group. And I tend to think of there being not a hard and fast distinction between those two. And this, I think, is borne out by how many philosophers such as Aristotle and Hume thought about this, that really what we have is a spectrum. Aristotle and then Hume both thought that we are social by nature, that we like to be together, that it's painful to be shunned or to be ostracized. Humans, according to David Hume, are partly selfish, of course. We are partly sympathetic and able to care about other individuals who we see are in need. We are able to take other points of view and to evolve institutions. And Darwin actually said something that I think fits very well with this. Darwin's conjecture was that our moral sense or conscience depends on a platform of social instincts, this desire to be together, liking to have friends, where that induces some form of pleasure. He thought that the development of habits were very important, and consequently, as we'll see, learning in a social context, especially for mammals and birds, is very important. And finally, that the capacity to solve problems, to reason, is also an important element. So the hypothesis then that I'm interested in exploring with regard to morality in the brain is that there are really sort of four interlocking components. There is caring, which is rooted, I think, and Franz de Waal noted this, but before him, I think also Paul MacLean, that caring for others in a social context, as we see in the case of social birds and mammals, is rooted in a very fundamental and crucial bit of circuitry for attachment of parent to offspring. It also involves the recognition of other psychological states, which might go about as theory of mind, if you like, or as the capacity to attribute mental states to others, which I think essentially is there because of its predictive value. It's very helpful to know when someone's body language is in a certain configuration, that means that he is feeling this way or that he has a particular goal or intention. And of course, the brain is all about movement and all about prediction that acts in the service of informing movement. The third element, as both Hume and Darwin rightly noted, is learning. I'll say much more about that later, and figuring out modifications to social practices. And I think we can expect, just as in the case of the development of physical tools like axes and spears, just as that took a long time to develop, so also did the emergence of social institutions that we now sort of take for granted. Institutions of criminal justice, for example, or enforcement, schools, religions, and so on. So in asking the question where moral values come from, perhaps the deeper question should be, where do any values come from? And here I think the story is really very straightforward, and that is that natural selection sees to it that all animals care for their own well-being, prosperity, and survival. If they don't survive, they don't have offspring, and so forth. And so from the very simplest animals to the most complex, there is, of course, organization to see to that. Sociality is very interesting and has almost certainly evolved in many different occasions. And here we see, for example, social insects, the bees. Probably our sociality is very different and is underlain by a rather different platform. The discus fish are rather interesting. They're social too, and here they do something that's a little bit like mammals, and that is they secrete a protein in their mucous membrane so that the babies cling on to that mucous membrane and help themselves to the protein, and it's a way of getting started the feeding in life. Now, the other point that is increasingly evident as we think about brain evolution is that it is remarkably conserved. And Terry talked a little bit about this yesterday in the context of the conservation of some of the basic structures and neurochemicals, but also as vertebrate nervous systems became more complex, we see that even there, the basic principles of organization are conserved. And so in this slide, we see these different things, and we think, well, you know, the brains there, they look really so different. And look at the brain of the rat, it's so tiny, it's very different. But it turns out, of course, as we are understanding from comparative anatomists and others, there's so much that's similar at a deeper level once you dig down from the superficial level. And in particular, and this also touches back to Terry's talk, the basal ganglia and the hypothalamic structures are remarkably conserved across all vertebrates. Now, of course, they're somewhat different. I mean, it's not like the basal ganglia of an alligator is just like the basal ganglia of a chimpanzee. So, because in the case of mammals, we have this laminar structure called cortex, the basal ganglia have to accommodate themselves to work with that. And so we do see those kinds of differences. Nevertheless, what's amazing to me is that Mother Nature didn't just sort of create a whole new deal for setting priorities, for reward learning, for reinforcement learning, for figuring out strategies for getting themselves around the planet. And in this particular slide, this is taken from a recent commentary by Harvey Carton. And it's a commentary on a paper showing that he was right about something. And that's always a really nice sort of commentary to be able to make. And what he was right about was something that people totally scoffed at for many years. And that was this. And this is important because birds are social. When you look at a bird brain, it doesn't look like they have anything like a cortex at all. There is no laminar structure there that looks anything like what you might see in a monkey or even in a rat. But it turns out if you follow the circuitry and the cell types to see what connects to what, it's essentially the same deal. It's just they have a cortex, so to speak, that isn't laminar. It's kind of spread out and hooked up in different ways. Now, a laminar cortex is kind of a nice thing to have because it lends itself to expansion. And maybe that particular organization that we see in the bird brain doesn't do that. In any case, what you're seeing here is the bird brain, the mammalian forebrain, and the homologous structures are similarly colored. And so it's so great that you see here this structure corresponds to that particular lamina in the cortex. So that's just by way of saying that when we see sociality in birds and sociality in mammals, and we see similarities, it may be that it's a matter of convergent evolution. It may also be that it's a matter of a common ancestor. But in any case, we do see with mammals this great expansion of laminar cortex, and we do see something very striking, which must have occurred long before the evolution of birds, and that is parental attachment. Now, I want to make another very fast digression here. I know that this is probably going to be familiar to many of you, but it kind of needs repeating just to remind ourselves. Concepts and categories, the everyday concepts we have a radial structure, by which I mean that they have sort of prototypes at the center where we all agree that that's an instance of the kind, and then further out are fuzzy boundaries, and in between with declining degrees of similarity to the prototypes are other kinds of cases. In other words, that for most of the categories that we have, there aren't precise definitions that specify necessary and sufficient conditions for class membership. And so the famous examples that Eleanor Roche started with were categories like vegetable, with which we're all very comfortable. And in the West, carrots are prototypical vegetables, radishes less so, and wild mushrooms probably even less so. They're kind of out there on the fuzzy boundaries. And we work very well with those sorts of categories all the time. And the fact that there are fuzzy boundaries, by and large, doesn't make any difference. Sometimes in science, I see why this is making a racket. Sometimes in science, there is a need to make a category more precise, like protein, for example. And when that happens, we can generally do it. But it's not necessarily the case that we should assume that the precision that often serves us well definitionally in science has got to be extended to all concepts of an everyday sort. And another concept that you can see is like this is the notion of a dwelling or a house. And depending on where you live, you may have a different prototype. So for the Inuit, that is a prototype house. But perhaps here in Orange County, something like that will be a prototype house. And for Plains Indians, Cheyenne, and so forth, that would be more typical. Now, this is worth mentioning just because, quite obviously, although different cultures may share a category, what constitutes the prototype, what's on the fuzzy boundaries, may, of course, vary. And the reason I mention this is because in the context of talking about morality and moral values, I think that we see a similar kind of logic at work with respect to the categories. So that we have all kinds of categories that apply to individuals within our social group, what it is to be friendly or to be honest or to be trustworthy. And we learn these via prototypes. We pretty much agree on the prototypes. There are, of course, fuzzy boundaries. Sometimes those boundaries are such that there is no right answer to the question of whether or not it is really a vegetable, or really a house, or really trustworthy. I think that the more general encompassing categories of what it is to be moral or to be not moral share that logic. They have a radial structure, fuzzy boundaries, where sometimes we don't agree, and there may be no right answer. Now then, just to go back to the main theme, the hypothesis is that sociality, at least in the case of mammals and birds, is a basic value. Now, it's important because there are evolutionary biologists, and at least for part of his career, Richard Dawkins was one of them, who thought that cooperation and altruism was something that would have to be forced on individuals, that it couldn't naturally emerge, and that it wouldn't just come about as a part of the way the social animals' brains actually work. And I think part of what was so wonderful in Robert Safar's talk yesterday is we could see how friends and sharing and being together and cooperating and grooming all could emerge in a very natural way without having to be forced on individuals. So sociability appears to be a basic value. What, of course, I'm interested in is what the brain mechanisms are for that. What changed with regard to the organization of the brain in the case of mammals that made that possible. And then it seems that oxytocin, but there are certainly other parts of the story, that oxytocin is at the hub of the story. That sociability in the case of mammals depends on the reward system, and that we see with the elaboration and expansion of the cortex a greater capacity for suppression of certain kinds of impulses, a capacity for learning, the sort of hand-holding between cortex and basal ganglia that makes certain kinds of impulses cease even to arise. So somehow, about 200 and so million years ago, there were a number of events that seem to have, in an interlocking way, we don't really know how this all worked, seemed to have occurred such that the upshot was warm-blooded mammals who cared for their young and who tended to live in groups. And certainly one of the very important things about this was homeothermy. The genetic changes that made it possible for brains to regulate temperature so that it was more or less constant despite fluctuations in the environment. The huge advantage that this allowed for animals who were warm-blooded was it meant that they could hunt at night, free from the reptilian predators, and perhaps even feeding on some of those. It also meant that they could migrate to colder places and survive quite well. So homeothermy was a very important part of the story, but homeothermy also came with this big cost. And the big cost is that if you are a homeotherm, you have to eat about 10 times as much as a comparably massed cold-blooded animal. And so that means that on a given patch of territory, you can support many, many fewer homeotherms than you can support, say, lizards. So that's a very interesting constraint. And one of the constraints, and one of the ways in which the constraints got expressed is that mammals, or warm-blooded animals, tended to have fewer offspring and to invest more heavily in their offspring as a consequence in order to have a sufficient numbers to survive to carry on the genes. It also meant that it was a good idea to have the wherewithal to tune up yourself to the environment. So if you're going to migrate somewhere, you better have the nervous system capacity to adapt to that environment. And so it looks like it was just a very good idea to have fewer offspring, to have them born very dependent, but with an enormous capacity to learn. With this thing, this laminar cortex that turns out to be very flexible, to be tunable up to all kinds of different environments. But to do that, Mother Nature had to do one thing, and that was, if the infants are going to be born dependent, then somebody had better make sure that they are helped to maturity. And so what we see, and the details of this are not precisely understood at this stage, but what we do see with mammals is that there is a change in the circuitry so that whereas I might have the circuitry in my basal ganglia and brainstem and hypothalamus to see to my own food and warmth and safety. That circuitry is modified so that when I have offspring, it's almost as though I treat them as an extension of myself. I now see to their food and warmth and safety in just the same way. Just as I feel pain when I'm cold, I feel pain when they are cold. Now there's kind of an intervening bit in here, which is that I can't directly feel when they are cold. And so the indirect bit is that the infant squeals or vocalizes its displeasure. And then I am, of course, going to feel pain at that because that's how my circuitry is organized. And so Mother Nature made sure that if there were going to be mammals, they had to be smart because they had to eat a lot, because they had to be very flexible, which means they have to be born very immature, and they have to have this fine thing, laminar cortex. Now, all vertebrates have oxytocin and its sibling peptide vasopressin. But in frogs, for example, it has no role in parental care. But it does have a role in contraction of smooth muscle for the ejection of eggs. But so oxytocin was put to a very new use in the case of mammals. Mesotocin, it seems, plays a comparable role in birds, but the data on that, I think, there remains much to be understood. Interestingly, oxytocin and vasopressin are actually still found not merely in the nervous system of mammals, but all over the body. So oxytocin is produced in the corpus luteum of the ovaries. It's produced in the testes, in the thymus, in the gut. And so we still carry with us many of the features that oxytocin was famous for before it was put to its use in mammals. Oh, I should just say also that the cuddling and the suckling is very important in infants, not just for nutritional reasons, but also it turns out that, and this has been shown in rat studies, that during the suckling, oxytocin is released into both the brain of the mother and the brain of the infant. And it also has a very important role in actually structuring receptor density in the brain of the offspring. And so offspring who are nurtured, so far as food is concerned, in the normal way, but don't get licked and stroked and so forth, do not have the same structural features for oxytocin as do the controls. So the basic picture here then is that with mammals, we see this really quite striking thing, and that is the expansion of the domain where the brain manages well-being. And this whole set of circuits and receptors and the whole organization that serves to make me feel good when I'm with the infant and it's safe, to feel pain when it's in danger or it's isolated from me, and so forth. Pleasure and pain, just as they are in premammalian vertebrates, just as they play a huge role in behavior there, so they play a huge role in parental behavior here. It's not a totally cortical story, as I sort of keep emphasizing. McGraw and Young in their TINS paper had this rather nice diagram showing that, of course, all of these subcortical structures are also linked to cortical structures. Moreover, and this is really important because there has been a certain amount of hype about oxytocin that gets extremely silly, calling it the love molecule and the moral molecule and so forth. It plays an important role, and in a certain sense it does regulate, to the degree that we understand it, some of the other activity in those subcortical structures. But we also know that all of these things, but especially the opioids and the endocannabinoids, play a huge role in sociality. It isn't just that oxytocin makes us feel good, but we know from rat studies and even from human studies that the endocannabinoids and the opioids are very important when we are with those that we love and that we feel are good and safe and comfortable and so forth. I'm not going to talk about this slide except to say it harkens back to Terry's talk about the basal ganglia yesterday. What you have here is cortex, and in red are the excitatory connections, in blue are the inhibitory connections, and the only point that I really want to make here is that in mammals, the basal ganglia are suited to our mammalian brain and have to fit in with our cortex, but also they have this wonderful loopy structure, which means that you can't cleanly separate values as being part of the cortex and other stuff as not being part of the cortex. So just to kind of sum up where we are, social urges involve pleasure and pain caused by social interactions. There's specific circuitry that's involved for that. And that we feel good when we are in a social context with those that we trust and care about. We feel pain if we are ostracized and shunned. So the question now is, okay, so that gives us a bit of a feel for how you get to parental care. What's the next step whereby you have friends, as Robert Seyfarth showed us in the case of baboons yesterday, and where it really matters that you have friends to sort of buffer you against all of the difficulties in life. And I think that part of the answer goes like this, that the big effect is this big change in mammalian brain that allows for caring of others at all. And then I think there are secondary changes that are, so to speak, small tweaks of that, probably by regulatory genes. And the clue for me, and other people are going to come at this in a different way, but the clue for me came from the story of the prairie voles. Most of you will know this story, but it's such a cool story, I have to tell you anyway. So there are many species of voles, and as you can see, they're these little rodents with their babies. And montane voles are pretty much what you expect. So the male is there, the female's there, they hop along, oh, they meet each other, they meet, they mate, they go on their merry old way. She has babies, he finds another mate. Prairie voles turned out to be quite different. So prairie voles, they hop along, they meet each other, they mate, they're bonded for life. They stay together. The male helps tend the infants. He huddles over them. He guards the nest. He protects them from predators. Nothing like this is seen in montane voles. It's also true in pine voles that we see behavior very similar to prairie voles. So their social behavior is really very, very different. And they live in communities with other voles, not montane voles. The siblings also, interestingly, these are just rodents, the siblings also help take care of the offspring. So Sue Carter asked this question: what's the difference in the brain between prairie voles and montane voles? And nobody really expected that the answer was going to be simple, and it probably isn't really very simple. But the crux of the answer seems to be this, that, of course, montane voles and prairie voles all have oxytocin and vasopressin. Oxytocin more abundant in all females, and vasopressin a little more abundant in all males. But what they found was that the density of receptors for oxytocin in the prairie voles is much higher in one very special part of the brain, which is part of the reward system, and that's the nucleus accumbens. And what about vasopressin? It turns out that in the prairie voles, but not in the montane voles, you see a much higher density of receptors, not of vasopressin itself, but of receptors or vasopressin in the ventral pallidum. Part, again, of the reward system. Part of that reinforcement learning system. Now, there are many other components to the story, including dopamine and the D1 receptors versus the D2s. The D2s are important for that formation of the bond, and the D1s prevent a formation of any further bonds. Now, a couple things have to be said here by way of qualification so that you don't get the wrong impression about the prairie voles. First of all, of course, we see variability, as we do in any biological population. So not all prairie voles conform to the story that I've just described, but that does characterize the most prairie voles. Also, long-term bonding does not imply sexual exclusivity. Yes, 5 minutes? Oh. Oh, I see, okay. Well, it does not imply sexual exclusivity, so I'm moving right along. Okay, so I don't want to say that culture isn't important, and I thought it was really interesting yesterday when John Searle talked about the variability between cultures, but I do want to say that attachment and trust are the platform for moral values. They are the sort of dispositions that contour the social problem space, that make us the way we are, and they are the motivation to find good solutions to practical problems. So as I said, culture is a very important part of the story, and cultures will vary with regard to what they consider to be acceptable behavior, and often those differences will reflect an ecology. So we can see very striking differences, for example, in aggression and the tolerance of aggressive behavior between, say, the Inuit and the Yanomamo. So the basic idea then is with small changes to such things as receptor density, we can see changes that will allow for attachment not just to offspring, but to mates, to kin, and also to friends. So one question, of course, we have is what does oxytocin really do? And much remains to be discovered here. We do know that it downregulates neuronal activity in that part of the amygdala that has to do with fear responses. It downregulates activity in the brainstem that supports sympathetic responses, supports the fight and flight responses. And so there is a kind of trade-off between levels of cortisol going up and levels of oxytocin going down, and the reverse. Okay, so depending on the ecology of the animal, there may be small differences that are going to explain the differences in the way the social organization works. It's very interesting to me that there are a small number of mammals, about 5%, that show long-term pair bonding as the prairie voles do. Marmosets, for example, do also. It's very interesting that in birds, probably because of the way they make their living and their particular equipment, in birds, long-term bonding is thought to be somewhere around 90%. So it's very interesting. Now, cooperation then seems to me not to require a special cooperation gene, but to emerge quite naturally in the context of sociality, where the animals trust one another, like one another, and so forth. And in this slide, I really just want to mention the benefits of cooperation. Of course, Robert Seyfarth talked yesterday about some of the benefits of having friends. But here, what's very cool is we see these wolves are going to drive this grizzly off a recent kill, namely a moose. And of course, any wolf on its own could not possibly do that. And so it takes these guys in a very organized fashion, which you can see roughly here. It takes the wolves a great organization and cooperation and structure in order to be able to pull this off, and they do. Now, again, yesterday, one of the things that I thought was very striking in Robert Seyfarth's talk was his point that it's not as though competition in social mammals kind of ceased to exist. That circuitry is all still there. It's just that we have this much more complicated situation where we have both competition and we have cooperation. And so it's very important, I think, to pay attention to those anthropologists who talk about the kinds of strategies for maintaining and controlling aggression in small groups and how they differ as a function of the circumstances. Okay, so the emergence of social institutions of any real significance kind of coincides with the development of agriculture about 10,000 years ago. There are larger settlements, and then we get towns where not everybody knows everybody else, as they do in a small hunter-scavenging group. And when that happens, probably it's then that we see the emergence of organized religion. So that even though I may not be there to persuade you not to do something that you're tempted to do, by virtue of teaching you that God will know even if I'm not there, that may have an effect on moderating your impulses, if you think that you're being watched nonetheless. Now, whether this is really necessary for maintaining social norms remains very controversial because, of course, many Asian religions do not have anything comparable to this. Okay, I'm just going to end with this slide. And it makes two kind of really important points. One is that, of course, we've all grown up to believe that orangutans are not social, that they live alone, they're loners by nature, blah-de-blah-de-blah. And yet, that may be something that they live with because they are largely herbivores and they each need a large territory. But certainly, given a chance to socialize, they seem to like it in just the way we all rather like it. And in this particular instance, this orang was at a rescue center. The dog came in. He kind of circulated around. He met this orang. They bonded, and they've been very, very close ever since. So, depending on resources, I think we can often see behaviors that might not be characteristic under very different circumstances. The other thing, and this is also kind of an obsession with me now, is that when you have something like cortex, which allows for such flexibility in where you live, what you learn, how abstract your concepts are, and so forth. I think that cortex also allows for a certain amount of slop. It doesn't rigorously steer us to exactly this and to exactly that. And consequently, I think it's not surprising that we see social behavior in places where you don't really expect it. And there are many, many, all you have to do is go on YouTube, but there are these wonderful pictures of dogs with fawns. Now, you would think that he would just be ripping the fawn to shreds. No, it feels good, and he's probably well fed. He doesn't need to do this. And so the slop that is part of the outcome of having this great massive cortex that is so immature at birth and can be steered into all of these directions, but still has the capacity to move here or there, I think helps explain why we see things that might, to an evolutionary biologist, seem surprising, like cross-species cooperation and like humans helping strangers. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you.